when we had looked at the purist movement, we saw an interest in a fascination with machine-made objects, objects that they said were purified by having been made by the machine. They're derived from nature and then made more perfect. Wine bottles, carafes, guitars, and whatnot. And we even see those ideas applied to non-machine made objects, whether they're trees or oxen or men. Everything seems as if it's machine made. Archipenko's Woman with a Fan looks nearly robotic in her construction. We also saw an interest in machinery among the other members of the Orphists. Remember that there's a connection between Léger and the Orphists. Léger was working in that Paris suburb of Puteaux alongside the Orphists and was associated with that golden section group to begin with. Machine motifs mean something to the Orphists. Machines are associated with science, and science is revealing all the time in the early 20th century a supernatural world that surrounds us. Electricity and radio and magnetism, all of these issues are coming together where people are realizing that through machines we can see beyond the physical world to other things. We also saw with the Orphists an interest in sound, in noise, cacophonous sound, and violent movement. And the point is that, of course, behind all of this violence, for the Orphists at least, behind the clanging machinery, behind the violence of football, the contact sport, and the sound that each of them makes, we can find peace and harmony, that it exists there as revealed by the golden section. These Orphist and purist interests in the machine came from the influence of another group of painters active in Paris around 1910. This was a group of foreigners, a group of Italian painters, who had come to Paris in 1911 to prepare for a major exhibition in 1912, the same year as the Golden Section group. This group is known as the Futurists, the Italian Futurists, the major modern movement in Italian painting, really for the entirety of the 20th century. The Futurists had a love for violent action, for progress based on machine engineering. And as we read their ideas, and as we look at their works, we'll find that for the Futurists, modern progress is going to sweep aside everything. And so in this picture on the left, which is in the Museum of Modern Art in New York, The City Rises, we see in many ways almost a visual testament to futurist ideas, of modern progress, pushing aside older traditions, pushing aside even the works of man in a way. So if we read the picture, we find, for example, that if we look at it close up, it's semi-cubist in the fragmentation of forms, but as we read the picture, it's much more literal than that. We're actually set deep within a construction site. We're in the foundation of a rising building. So this is the part where they got below the ground in order to lay the foundation to hold the high-rise building. And as we look at the picture more closely, we find that there's a series of horses that are being used for the construction, but they've gone mad, they've gone wild, and they're sweeping aside everything around them as they charge around this construction site, almost like it's some sort of rodeo or horse race, and the human figures are trying in vain to contain the energy of these wild beasts as they tear loose on this construction site. As we look around them, we see the building rising behind it, thus the title of the work, The City Rises, although it's also a play on words on the idea of revolution and uprising. And here in the upper right corner, we see belching smokestacks and a steel frame of a high-rise structure beginning to be clad in other materials, almost like a beacon of a positive future. You'll notice how the light shines through it and beams down toward us, the rays diverging along the right of this detail. In the upper left corner, we see a trolley car moving by, men on horseback, people on the streets, rendered somewhat abstract, but almost as if they're spectators watching this amazing show of industrial progress, everything pulsing with energy and movement. These futurist artists like Baccioni arrive in Paris in 1911 to prepare for a group show in 1912, the same year as the Golden Section. And it is the futurists who seem to have inspired the Orphist group to give us images of figures in action, images that look to the power of the machine. The group was founded by a poet named Filippo Tommaso Marinetti, and in 1909 he wrote a manifesto, the Futurist Manifesto, which recounted how the group was formed and what their basic ideas were. And he took out space on the front page of the major daily newspaper in Paris, knowing that that was the center hub of the art world, and had the Futurist Manifesto here outlined in these small green lines, right? It's just this area here is the Futurist Manifesto. Published on the front page of the Figaro on the 20th of February in 1909. The manifesto begins with a mad narrative recounting the night that they founded the group, sitting around all night, my friends and I, he says. He likens their hearts to flaming electric lamps. And they're bored at home as they're talking, and they decide to go out and do something. So they race outside, and they jump into waiting sports cars and go driving like mad through the streets of Milan. It's an amazingly well-written account. It's really quite fun to read. He talks about when they get in the cars, they are laying beneath the steering wheel a guillotine knife that threatened my stomach. He says that death ran before us at each corner, offering his hand to us nicely. He talks about careening through the streets, menacing everyone, quote, crushing watchdogs beneath our burning wheels like shirt collars under the iron. And then he talks about the fact that while this is blasting on, he comes around the corner and suddenly there were two cyclists in the way. I stopped short and hurled myself in disgust. Flan, he says, using a sound word. Head over heels into a ditch, half full of muddy water, a factory gutter. And he starts to suck in the muck and revel in it. And sort of this then leads him to make the statements of the manifesto. What are they going to talk about? This account of this crazy night. And here is the Futurist Manifesto. The 11 major points, I've pared it down to just a few of them, and I wanted to highlight some things in it. In this first image, we see certain things in the 11-point memo that are themes that are consistent in it. And in this particular case, a focus on the machine and how it's changed modern experience, the machine as a positive symbol of progress. So under number 4, we see the beauty of speed, talking about a roaring motor car which seems to run on machine gun fire is more beautiful than the Nike of Samothrace. Down in point number 8, what's the use of looking back? This is all about futurism. We're looking toward the future. We have already created eternal, omnipresent speed. Down in the last point, we will sing of the nocturnal vibration of arsenals, the gluttonous railway stations devouring smoking serpents, factories suspended from the clouds by the thread of their smoke. Everything is seen positively, right? Factories aren't ugly things belching smog, but that smoke stream connects them to heaven. Bridges with the leap of gymnasts flung across the diabolic cutlery of sunny rivers, adventurous steamships sniffing the horizon. All of these machines are anamorphized. Great-breasted locomotives puffing on the rails like enormous steel horses. The gliding flight of airplanes, whose propeller sounds like the flapping of a flag and the applause of enthusiastic crowds. The futurists are embracing machinery and engineering as the single great metaphor of the modern age, of the future, and seeing in it nothing but positive elements. At the same time, laced through the Futurist Manifesto are themes of danger, themes of threat and violence. In the first point, we want to sing the love of danger, the habit of energy and rashness. Point 3, we want to exalt movements of aggression, feverish sleeplessness, the double march, the perilous leap, the slap and the blow with the fists. They are anarchists. Point 7, beauty exists only in struggle. There is no masterpiece that has not an aggressive character. Poetry must be a violent assault. Down in number 10, we want to demolish museums and libraries. Right? These are all things of the past that have to get out of the way for the futurist future. Number 11, we will sing of the great crowds agitated by work, by pleasure, and by revolt. Everything is violence and upheaval, revolution being brought about by modern progress. Amid all of that are very troubling statements about war and about women. On point 9, we want to glorify war, the only cure for the world. Militarism, patriotism, the destructive gesture of the anarchists, the beautiful ideas which kill, and contempt for woman. I don't agree with any of this stuff, but that's what they were evoking, that the machinery will lead to war. War will cure the world of its problems, which include women no longer knowing, quote-unquote, their rightful place. In point 10, we will fight morality and feminism and all opportunist and utilitarian cowardice. So it should come as no surprise that these futurists are deeply problematic as well. They have deeply troubling ideas. The futurists worked also in sculpture. Baccioni worked in multiple media. And again, this sculpture, continuity in space, unique forms of continuity in space. It's again trying to capture in a static object the sense of movement over the course of time. The figure is intended to be seen striving forward toward a future, but leaving these blurred lines behind him as he's moved through space, so we have traces of where he's been as he pushes his way forward. The musculature now rendered as these aerodynamic forms. In the Futurist Manifesto, it talked about its love of modern technology, of machines, of cars, of airplanes, of ocean liners. And I think you can see as we look at this form that it's very, very machine-like. It's very much like these modern forms of transportation, which allowed transportation at a speed previously entirely unknown. As we look more closely at Baccioni's sculpture, we see that the entire surface is covered with these hairline grinding and polishing marks that make it look exactly like any number of camshafts or fenders, engine parts or body parts of a car or a machine. And again, the manifesto talked about the fact that the modern automobile was more beautiful than the Nike of Samothrace. And I think in many ways, Baccioni's unique forms is a modern translation of the Nike of Samothrace, striding forward with one leg, the arms disappearing behind it as it pushes its way into the future. Now, as I mentioned, we do have a few futurist works here in town that we can look at. Here's from the Hirshhorn, a work by Giacomo Balla, a member of the futurist group, where again, like Baccioni, he's giving us these metallic machine shapes, arranged looking like fenders or hoods of automobiles or parts of some sort of dynamo, a motor that drives it from the inside. It's in stark 3 dimension, coming out almost menacingly from the wall. Sharp knives and scythes, which were metaphors that Marinetti used in the Futurist Manifesto. This idea of danger. Remember, he talked about singing the love of danger. And we certainly see that here. Balla works these ideas. They're all based on speeding automobiles in paint as well, where he's again, like our Orphists, painting sound. This is kind of where they got the idea in the first place. Where here, this is one of a series of 3 works that traces the effects of sound as an automobile comes racing by. And I think you can begin to see, as we look at them side by side, that many of the same forms appear and reappear. So we have this form here, we have this form here, sort of reappearing again and again. And you start to make out that there are these similarities in composition between the painted version and the sculpted version. And just as the sculpted version breaks the frame on the edges of the rectangle and also extends toward us in space, so too the paint in Balla's painted version of the same cannot be bound by the frame of the picture, but spills over the edges and suggests that the dynamism that he's depicting simply cannot be contained. It's too powerful for that. So again, he's very much inspired by the idea of automobiles, of cars, of dangerous, relentless speed. And as we look at this early Alfa, what eventually became Alfa Romeo, and we look at the fenders of the car, the hood, the streamlined hood, we can begin to see where Balla and the futurists in general are getting so many of their forms directly out of automotive design, industrial design, designs for things that are designed specifically for speed. That's it for the futurists as well. They're designed for speed. Here in Wire, very much the same composition again. You can make out some of the same forms being picked up in Wire, where the crevasses between the peaks are now rendered in these forms. And again, each one of those are meant to relate to particular ideas of speed, of noise, of sound, now rendered visually. And again, somewhat dangerous, sharp-edged, and menacing. Not every futurist work, however, is dangerous and menacing. Some of them are really quite cute. One of the most famous of these images, and probably famous because it's safe, is this woman with an ankle-length dress walking her dachshund down the street, where as the time elapses, the chain whips, the dachshund's tail wags, the feet scatter, as does the women's. You can hear this picture as you look at it. Up in Baltimore, we have the best example locally of a futurist painting by Gino Severini, again, one of the original members of the futurist group from Italy. He had been in Paris already from around 1906 onward, and he is in many ways the primary link between the futurists and the cubists, and was instrumental in helping to organize that big futurist exhibition that eventually took place the same year as the Golden Section Group in 1912. In this case, again, it's a painting based on the dynamic movement of a human figure. Really, there's nothing to be found in the way of a sort of a futurist still life. Or when there is, it ends up looking as if it's moving as well. So here is a dancer in the center in pink kicking up her heels, dancing the can-can at one of the bistros on the Montmartre in Paris. And you can make out the legs, you can make out the feet, right? So the back leg here, the front leg here. These swirls around to be the dress opening up. There's her head back in this direction. But again, like Baccioni, like Balla, what Severini is trying to do is capture the sense of movement. And that accounts for the sound lines, it seems, that emanate away from the movement, these concentric circles that are meant to suggest her movement around Pigalle, the name of the bistro, of the cabaret. And we can see members of the audience looking on, but you'll notice that each of those figures has been obliterated by the sound, by the movement, in the same way that the Orphists would obliterate physical things with light. And again, there's quite a tight association between what the Futurists had done and what the Orphists picked up from it. If we look more closely at Severini's work, we can see that he's building up the gesso so that the surface is in relief. Parts of it are higher than others. Some of the shadows are painted, but some of them are true cast shadows because the gesso has been built up underneath to form a relief. And again, it's that Futurist idea that the energy that they're trying to capture cannot be held in two dimensions. You'll also notice in this detail on the right that the dots that appear are in fact sequins from clothing that have been glued to the surface, sequins from an actual dress. On one level, this is a very literal evocation of the dress that the dancer would have worn, itself glittering as the dancer moved. But on the other hand, these sequins also, because they themselves reflect light, make the actual work of art itself more dynamic. It moves and it changes, and it affects the space around it in a way that breaks free of any kind of container, of any kind of frame. So these Futurists had a strong influence on other artists after they arrived in Paris in 1911. The Orphists in particular owe a great debt to the Futurists. It was the Futurists who first decided to focus on the moving object, and the Orphists got that idea from them, both of these breaking from the Cubists, who had a still object and a moving viewer. Other members who we'll talk about more later of the group working in Puteaux, Marcel Duchamp, also very much influenced by the Futurists. Here, the nude woman, robotic, cubist in its colors, like Picasso and Braque in analytic cubism, but now moving down a staircase, and Duchamp capturing that sense of movement. Here, an American artist, Lionel Feininger, who had visited Paris in 1912-1913, paints a work of art very much indebted to Cubism on the one hand, but also quite obviously to Futurism in its evocation of speed and movement through the repetition of a single figure in different colors. Because it was begun by a poet, Filippo Marinetti, Futurism always had a really strong literary angle as well, and we see this in a work in the National Gallery by another of our Futurists, Carlo Carrà, Graphic Rhythm with an Airplane, Hommage à Blériot. The upper part is the Hommage à Blériot, and you can see it's a piece of paper that's been tipped onto the surface. And Blériot was Louis Blériot. He was a French aviator who had flown across the English Channel in 1909. And what Carrà has done at the top is to give us a bunch of words that are more or less gibberish, but are meant to evoke sounds. So we see iku, iku, Blériot, Belou, and then other words, anima, aspirale, animale, metizia, all arranged as if they are the form of an airplane flying through the sky, not arranged in traditional forms, traditional typographic layout. These are then associated at the bottom with words that evoke an adulterous affair. Words that are about, you can see right here, adultera, adultery. And there's a connection being made between machinery and sex, between man conquering gravity through machinery, and because they're sexist, man conquering woman through adultery at the bottom. Marinetti himself was very good in graphic layout of futurist ideas. He called this break with typographic traditions words at liberty. And he not only breaks words from traditional typography, but he and Cara are also breaking with the tradition of syntax. Traditional structures are totally destroyed, and in fact, Marinetti wrote a futurist manifesto specifically for poetry, which was called The Destruction of Syntax. These were traditional rules that had to be destroyed for the freedom of art. And so as we open up Zang Tum Tum, we see words deployed across the page in a way that denies the traditional layout of books, and where words don't really give us sentences with subject, verb, object, but rather evoke the meaning or the experience that Marinetti had. This was an account of his experience as a reporter in Turkey, covering the Balkan War in 1912, the attack of the Bulgarians at that particular point. And if you remember the manifesto, war is going to cure the world. So Marinetti saw this war that he was covering as a reporter as being an entirely positive thing. He's enthralled with the sounds of war, the sounds of machinery. And the title of the work, Zang Tum Tum, are in fact the mechanical sounds of war. Right? He writes in the manifesto for futurist poetry that he wants a typographic revolution directed against the idiotic and nauseating concepts of the outdated and conventional book. We must destroy syntax by placing nouns at random as they are born. And this is so his layout here, very artistic, where here is one of the Turkish balloons during the war, and the words there, right, inflated Turkish balloon, laid out to show us the shape of the balloon, and then the cords down below tying it to the earth. So again, breaking all the rules, right? The futurists are. This is really a very important movement, even though I disagree deeply with the politics of the futurists. Not only do I find their art still fascinating, I also think that as a movement in around 1910, they are incredibly important because they make very influential developments away from Cubism. Without the Futurism movement, for example, we would not have Orphism and their interest in sound. We would not have Purism and its interest in the machine. Neither of these would have developed had the Futurists not come to Paris. And what we're going to see in coming classes is that their overtly socio-political stance, really very different from Cubism, very different from Fauvism. This is part of the template for a number of other movements that we're going to see in the 1910s and the 1920s as this radical social engagement.